The cold air that Thursday evening carried a stillness I had learned, over 40 years of walking mountain ridgelines, to read like a second language. I knew what still air meant in late autumn on that ridge. I knew the difference between the quiet of a valley floor at dusk and the particular held breath quality of timber that has decided to keep something to itself. I had learned that difference from Nell, mostly from walking beside her on that same trail every week for 31 years. Her voice low beside me, sometimes praying, sometimes just naming the trees as we passed them. She knew every hemlock and red oak on that 2-mile stretch by some quality of bark and lean that I never fully developed. And she hummed. She was always humming, especially on the way home, when the weight of other people's troubles had settled into her like water into clay, and the humming was how she lightened it. I stood on that trail that Thursday night and heard her hymn come out of the trees, and I want to be honest with you from the start. I am not a man who reports things he cannot account for. I have spent my life being careful with what I say is true. But I need to go back about 2 years to explain what that sound meant, and why I am only now telling anyone at all. Nell died in November, 2 years before the night I am describing. She died on a Tuesday, and by Thursday of that same week, I had already walked the ridge trail once, alone, because I did not know what else to do with my hands and my legs at 6 in the morning. That is the kind of man I am. Grief arrived in me as a problem that needed solving, and since I could not solve it, I gave it motion. I walked, I made my pastoral visits. I sat with my congregations sick and their dying and their newly born, and I said the right words, which were true enough words, words I believed in entirely, and I drove home in the dark and stood in the kitchen and understood that the room was now a different size. Not smaller, larger. The kind of larger room becomes when the person who kept it, proportioned to human life, is no longer in it. Nell had cooked in that kitchen every morning for 31 years. She had mended socks at the table under the east window. She had worn a path in the linoleum between the stove and the sink that I still try not to step in, as though my foot might damage something that is already gone. And she had hummed. That is the thing I keep returning to, the thing that cost me the most to lose. She hummed almost without awareness, the way some people tap their fingers or move their lips when they read. The hymn she returned to most was an old one, 4/4 time, the kind of tune that has been in those mountains long enough that nobody remembers bringing it there. It has words, of course, all hymns have words, but Nell's version was wordless most of the time, just the melodic line riding her breath, rising and dipping through the verses as she worked. I can hear her voice doing it right now, this many months later, and I could hear it then too, in memory, which is the cruelest thing about grief. You do not forget the specific sounds. You hear them on the wrong side of everything. I could not hum it myself. I want to be plain about that because it matters to the rest of what I am telling you. I tried once, about 6 weeks after she died, standing at the kitchen sink washing a single bowl, and the first 3 notes came out and then something in my throat closed and would not reopen. I set the bowl down and stood at the window for a long time looking at the hemlock at the corner of the yard, and I did not try again. I preached hymns. I led my congregation in singing every Sunday, and I knew the tune by its place in the service, but I had stopped making it personally. The hymn existed at a distance from me, a thing I administered rather than inhabited, and that is where I left it, because I did not have the means to carry it any closer. The estrangement from my son Dale was quieter and more permanent feeling than anything I said aloud. Dale had come home for the funeral and had stayed 9 days, and then had driven his truck back west, and the phone calls had thinned across the first winter from once a week to once a month to once every season, and eventually The pauses between them grew long enough that I stopped measuring. He called in April. He called in September. By the second year, those calls had become something I dreaded in a low-grade way, because they required me to say I was fine. And Dale had his father's instinct for the thing the voice is not saying, and I could feel him hearing what I was not saying, and neither of us knew how to address it directly, so we addressed nothing, and hung up, feeling worse than before. I stopped calling him. He stopped calling me, or mostly stopped. That was the shape of the estrangement, not a rupture. A silence that had hardened gradually until it felt structural, like a wall that had always been there. I was a pastor, and I knew every scripture and counsel for grief, and I had delivered them to people I loved on the worst days of their lives. And I believed them, all of it. But knowing a thing and living inside it are two different jurisdictions entirely. I knew I was not supposed to carry this alone. I also knew that my congregation would have gathered around me in an instant if I had let them, and I did not let them, because the shape of my work required that I be the one doing the gathering. That is not a complaint. It was simply the arrangement of my life, and I had chosen it freely, and I honored it. I just also carried what I carried in the spaces between. Jasper was my only regular companion on the Ridge Trail by then. He was 9 years old that autumn, a blue-tick hound of no particular distinction in terms of hunting, since I had never hunted him, and he had never seemed to miss it. He was a trail dog and a porch dog and a dog who knew the difference between a sound that required attention and a sound that did not, and he communicated that difference through his posture rather than his voice. If something alarmed him, his whole spine changed. His tail dropped, and his ears sharpened, and he went still in the particular way prey animals go still. If something merely interested him, he would stop and tilt his head and then resume walking after a moment's consideration. I had come to trust his read on the woods the way I trusted a reliable barometer. He was not infallible. He was 9 and had bad hips and smelled of the wood stove at all times. But he was present, and in that second year of widowhood, presence had become a kind of mercy I did not take lightly. The Thursday in question was the 3rd week of November. The light had been going by 4 o'clock all week, and by the time I finished my visit with Ruth Casper, the parishioner I had gone to see, it was past 8 in the evening, and full dark. Ruth was 81 and had broken her hip the previous summer, and lived alone in a house her husband had built before he died, which meant she lived surrounded by the specific evidence of a man who was no longer there, and I found her company both difficult and necessary in the way that things which mirror our own condition often are. We had talked for 2 hours over coffee she made too strong, and pie she made exactly right. And she had asked after Dale without any particular intention, except that she had always asked after Dale and did not know to stop, and I had told her he was doing well out west, which was what I always said. And she had nodded, and we had both understood that the conversation was finished on that topic. I walked out to her porch at 8:15 or so, called Jasper up from where he had been sleeping in the dry leaves under the hydrangea, and turned for the trail. The cold that night was the dry, still kind. No wind. Temperature probably in the low 20s by then. The kind of cold that makes the air feel thin and clear so that small sounds carry farther than you expect. I could hear my own boots on the frozen ground before I even reached the trailhead, each step a small crack of compressed leaf and frost. The stars were dense and close-feeling the way they get on clear, cold nights above 4,000 feet, and the hemlock stand at the head of the trail was a dark wall against the lighter dark of the sky. Jasper walked ahead of me, which was his habit, staying about 6 feet out and checking back every 30 yards or so with a look that seemed to confirm I was still there and still unconcerned. The first half-mile of the trail runs along the east face of the ridge, through mixed timber, hemlock and red oak and some old yellow birch. And in November there is no understory left to obscure the view between the trunks, just the dark columns of the trees and the frost-whitened ground between them. I knew every bend of that trail well enough to walk it without a flashlight, which I did most evenings from habit, or perhaps from the feeling that carrying a flashlight changed your relationship to the dark in ways that were not always useful. The dark and I had an arrangement. I moved through it quietly, and it let me through. Somewhere around the half-mile mark, the woods went quiet in a way they should not have. I am going to try to describe this precisely because it was not dramatic in the way you might imagine. There was no sudden silence, no movie version drop of every sound at once. What happened was more gradual and more specific than that. The two great horned owls that called to each other from opposite ridges on most clear evenings had stopped. The small rustlings that deer and mice and other night-moving creatures make in dry leaves had stopped. The sound of the creek, which ran about 200 yards down the slope, and which I had been hearing since I left Ruth's, had not stopped, of course, because water does not decide to be quiet. But it was suddenly the only sound there was, and its constancy threw everything else into relief. The woods had pulled inward. That is the best I can say it. Jasper stopped. He did not stiffen in alarm. He planted his feet on the trail and tilted his head to the left, toward the uphill timber, and I watched his ears and his spine and saw nothing that told me danger. He simply stood, reading something I could not yet read, and I stopped beside him and listened with him. I will tell you what I thought first. I thought another hiker, maybe someone from the road who had come up on the trail late and was ahead of me somewhere in the timber. I waited for the sound of boots or a light bobbing between the trees, and heard and saw neither. I thought then that it might be a bear, moving late in the season before the cold pushed it fully down. And I looked at Jasper again, because Jasper had been within 10 feet of a black bear once on this very trail, and had communicated it to me clearly through posture. He was not doing that now. He was still just listening, his tail at a neutral angle, his breathing easy enough that I could see the vapor of it rising at its ordinary rate. I stood with him in the cold and tried 3 explanations, and none of them took. And then I was just standing there with an old hound at my knee and the creek 200 yards below us, and no sound between me and the ridgeline above except the cold. The humming came from uphill, from inside the timber. If you have not tried to hear a tune hummed softly in an outdoor distance, I will tell you that what reaches you is not always the full melody, but the shape of it, the way it rises and falls, the intervals between notes. What I heard was low and carried, and described a melodic arc that my body recognized before my mind had organized an opinion about it. One phrase. The same phrase Nell had hummed 1,000 mornings in the kitchen, starting on the 5th note of the scale and resolving down across 4 beats to the tonic. It was not Nell's voice. It was a lower instrument entirely, something with more air in it, a resonance that belonged to a chest I could not have pictured. But the shape of the phrase was hers. The shape was exact. I stood entirely still for what I think was a full minute. The phrase completed and did not repeat. The woods held their pulled inward quiet for another long stretch, and then slowly, in the way these things reverse themselves, I heard a mouse run through leaves somewhere downhill, and then the creek reasserted itself fully, and one of the owls spoke from the far ridge. Jasper shook his ears once, the way dogs do when they have finished attending to something, and resumed walking up the trail. I followed him. I did not run. My legs worked, and my breath was steady enough, and I kept walking, and I did not try to name what had just happened, because I had spent all 3 of my explanations and had none left to offer. I want to say one thing here because it matters for the rest of what I describe. I was not frightened. I want to be precise about that, because the absence of fear in that moment is the part of the story I have examined most carefully in the months since. I should have been frightened. A large thing was in the timber above me at 8:30 in the evening, on a dark trail 2 miles from any house. Every reasonable instinct should have moved me toward alarm. Instead, what I felt was something I can only describe as an adjacent quality, something close to recognition, though not the recognition of a person or a thing I had ever encountered before. It was more like the recognition of an intention, something in the way the phrase was offered, in the completeness of it, and then the silence after, read to me as careful rather than careless, as deliberate rather than accidental. I have been a pastor for a long time. I know what it looks like when something is trying to be understood. Jasper and I covered the remaining 1.5 miles without incident. I reached the house at 9:15, unlocked the back door, and built the fire up from the coals. And I sat in the kitchen for a time with my hands around a cup of coffee, just sitting there, not thinking in any organized way, just occupying the chair and the warm room and the quiet. I noticed that I was not trembling. I noticed that the kitchen did not feel quite as large as it usually did in the evenings. I did not know what to make of either of those observations, so I set them aside and went to bed. In the morning, Jasper found the laurel branch before I reached the porch step. I had opened the back door to let him out, and I heard him stop on the step, which was unusual, because he typically went directly off the porch and around to his morning territory without pausing. I came to the door and looked out, and he was standing on the step with his nose working over something that lay across the width of it. A branch of mountain laurel, about 18 inches long, had been laid there, placed rather than dropped, the cut end aligned with the left edge of the step, the leafy end extending past the right. The break was clean, not ragged the way a branch breaks when it falls. It had been worked loose with some deliberate attention. Mountain laurel was not a tree I had on my property in any abundance. The nearest stand was 30 yards up the slope into the timber, and laurel branches do not migrate to porch steps through any mechanism I know of. I picked it up and held it in both hands. The leaves were still supple, not frozen, which meant it had been placed there sometime in the night, rather than in the earlier evening cold. I turned it over once and looked at the broken end, and then I set it carefully on the porch railing and went inside, and poured my coffee, and stood at the east window for a long time, looking at the hemlock at the corner of the yard. I am not a person who believes easily in things he cannot explain. I want to be clear about that. My faith is not a faith in the inexplicable. It is a faith in the coherence of a world that was made with intention, and that coherence, I have always thought, expresses itself through ordinary means, at least as often as through extraordinary ones. What I was looking at in that laurel branch was not something I could fit into the ordinary means column without considerable violence to the facts. So I stood at the window and let the two things exist at once, the branch and the inability to account for it, and the him, and the inability to account for that either. I thought about calling Dale that morning. I thought about it while I was drinking my coffee, and again while I was splitting the kindling I had been putting off all week. I did not call him in the morning. I split the kindling instead, which was its own kind of argument with myself, because splitting kindling at 9 in the morning is a thing you do when you need your hands to be busy while your mind works something through. I split more than I needed. I had enough kindling by the time I quit to last until March. I called Dale that afternoon. It was a Thursday, and the last time I had called him on a Thursday was probably a year before that, maybe longer. He answered on the third ring, which surprised me, and the sound of his voice doing the ordinary work of saying hello was enough to make the next sentence harder than it should have been. If you are not a person who struggles with phone calls, I am not sure I can fully explain it. What I want you to understand is that the silence between Dale and me had not been built by anger. It had been built by the same material that had built most of the harder things in my life, which was avoidance of a thing I did not know how to address. I did not know how to say to my son that I was not managing as well as I appeared to be managing. I did not know how to say that the house was too large and the trail was too quiet, and that I had stopped being able to hum a hymn his mother had loved. So I had not said any of it, and the not saying had accumulated until calling felt like trying to move a door that had warped in its frame. "Dale," I said. "Dad." A pause. "Everything all right?" "Yes," I said, and then I said, "No, not entirely." I heard him shift, the sound of him sitting forward somewhere, a chair creak or a hand setting something down. "Tell me," he said. I told him some of it. Not the trail, not the humming, not yet, not over a phone in the afternoon light. I told him I had been carrying the second year harder than the first, and that I had been doing a poor job of reaching out, and that I was sorry for the poor job. He was quiet for a moment after I said it. Not the quiet of someone who does not know what to say, but the quieter quiet of someone who is deciding which true thing to say first. "I've been doing a poor job too," he said. "I think I kept waiting for you to be okay before I called, and you kept not calling, so I figured you were." "I wasn't," I said. "I know," he said. We talked for 20 minutes, which was more than we had managed in any single call in the previous 8 months. It was not a resolved conversation. It was not a repaired relationship achieved in a single phone call in a November afternoon, because relationships do not repair that way, and we both knew it. But it was a door that opened. The specific weight of avoidance that had been sitting in my chest every time I thought of his name was not gone, but it was different. It had shifted from structural to workable. That is the best way I can put it. He said he might come out in the spring. I said I would like that. We made no precise plans, which was wise, because precise plans made at the first real conversation after a long silence have a way of collapsing under their own ambition. But the spring was named, and I held that. I kept the laurel branch on the porch railing until the leaves dried and went brown, and began to crumble, which took about 3 weeks. I did not put it away. I let it be there, and I looked at it in the mornings when I came out to check the temperature and fill the bird feeder, and it said the same thing every morning, which was not a thing I could have put into precise language, but which I received clearly enough. It said that the night on the trail had not been a trick of exhaustion or grief-distorted hearing. It said the night had been real, and that something had intended it to be real, and had left a material record for exactly the reason material records are left, which is so the person who needs to know does not spend their life wondering. I have turned over a number of explanations for what was in those trees that night. I have turned them over the way you turn over a stone to see what is underneath, and every explanation I have tried has the same problem, which is that it does not account for the hymn. It does not account for the specific melodic shape, which is not a shape that wind makes, and not a shape that any bird I know of in those mountains makes. It does not account for the single complete phrase and the silence after, which is the structure of a deliberate offering rather than an accidental sound. I am a careful man. I do not arrive at conclusions quickly. I have given this 2 years of occasional and serious thought, and I am no closer to a categorical answer than I was on the porch the morning Jasper found the laurel branch. Something large was in the timber on the eastern face of that ridge on a Thursday night in November, and it knew a tune that had been Nell's before it was anything else, and it offered it once and then withdrew, and then it left a branch of mountain laurel on the step of a house where a woman had once hummed while she cooked and mended and walked. I will tell you what I think that means plainly, without dressing it up. I think something in those woods had been paying attention for a long time. Not to me particularly, or not only to me, but to the life that had been lived on that ridge and the trails running off it. Something had heard Nell's humming on the years of walks we had taken together, and it had carried that sound, and it had offered it back to me on a night when the cold and the dark and the solitude had compressed to their particular heaviest point. Not as a solution, not as an answer to anything I had asked, because I had not asked. As a witness, the way you place a hand on someone's shoulder not to fix what they are carrying, but to let them know the weight has been seen. I am a pastor. I have preached on the seen and the unseen for 40 years, on the presence of grace in the material world, on the ways attention can arrive from directions you did not expect. I have preached on these things and believed them and sometimes felt them and sometimes just known them from a distance, the way you know the doctrine without the experience of it. That night on the Ridge Trail was the first time in 2 years that I had felt, rather than merely known, that the world was not indifferent to what I was carrying. That is a significant thing for a pastor to have to admit, but I am admitting it. The weeks after the phone call with Dale had a different texture than the weeks before. Not better in every particular, not resolved, but different in the specific way that comes when a load is distributed between more than one person. I still walked the Ridge Trail alone, still made my pastoral visits, still came home to the kitchen that was larger than it should have been. But I checked the porch step most mornings, out of a habit that had not been there before. And I looked at the tree line on the uphill side of the ridge with something other than the reflexive tiredness I had been carrying toward most views of the natural world. I looked at it the way you look at a window when you know someone you trust is somewhere on the other side of it. 3 weeks after that Thursday, on a morning in early December when the temperature had dropped below 15 and the frost on the kindling pile was thick enough to see from the porch, I went out to split the morning's wood. Jasper came with me and lay down in a patch of weak sun near the woodpile, his chin on his front paws, his eyes tracking me the way he tracked any repeated motion. I set the first piece of red oak on the block and lifted the maul and split it clean, and set the halves aside and reached for the next piece. And somewhere in the motion of reaching, without deciding to, without planning it or attempting it, or even being aware it was coming, I hummed the first phrase of the hymn. I stopped when I heard myself. I stood there with the next piece of oak in my hand and Jasper watching me, and the frost thick on the ground and the ridge visible in the cold, clear air above the hemlock line. And I stood there and understood what had just happened. The phrase had come back out of me the way things come back, that have been waiting rather than lost. It did not hurt the way I had expected it to hurt. It hurt the way things hurt when they begin to heal rather than when they simply wound, which is different, more specific, more a sensation of something working properly than of something failing. I set the oak on the block and I split it, and I hummed the second phrase and then the third, and by the time I had reached the verse's end I was standing in the cold with a maul in my hand, and tears going cold on my face, and Jasper watching me with the uncomplicated patience of a dog who does not need things to make sense in order to be comfortable with them. I did not try to stop any of it. I just stood there in the December morning and let the hymn come out of my chest and rise past the hemlock and the ridge and the cold, pale sky above it. Dale came in April, as we had said he might. He stayed 5 days, which was the longest visit since the funeral, and we walked the Ridge Trail together on the second afternoon, the two of us and Jasper, and I showed him the hemlock stand at the half-mile mark, and I told him about the Thursday in November. I did not tell him everything. I told him I had heard something in the timber that night that I could not account for, and that it had played a part in my decision to call him, and that I was glad I had called. He listened the way he listens, which is all the way, without interrupting, his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the trail ahead. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said he was glad I called too. And that was the extent of the conversation on that subject. He went back west on a Sunday. He called the following Thursday, and I called him the Thursday after that. And we have been Thursday people since then, the way some families are Sunday people or Saturday people, the way ritual asserts itself when you give it a chance. The laurel branch fell apart completely by mid-December, the dried leaves crumbling until I swept the fragments off the railing one morning and let them go. But I had been out on that ridge a dozen times since November, walking it in every kind of weather the mountain offered, and I had not heard the humming again. I had not expected to. It was not the kind of thing that repeated. I understood that, without knowing how I knew it. It had been offered once, completely, and the completeness was the point. You do not say the same necessary thing twice to a person who heard you the first time. I still do not have a name for what was in those trees. I have held the question honestly for 2 years, and the question does not require an answer to remain meaningful. I know what it gave me. I know what shape it took. I know that something in those woods had been paying close attention to a life I thought was being lived in private, and that on a specific cold night when I needed to be reminded that the hymn was still mine to carry, it was reminded to me. I cannot tell you what it was. I can tell you it was deliberate and large and careful and kind in a way that required knowing me without my permission. I've told this to 2 people, my son Dale in pieces on that April walk, and now to you. I want you to understand that I did not tell it because I could prove it, or because I wanted you to believe it, or because I have finally found the theological category for it. I told it because I have been carrying it with the same respectful care that I would carry any gift I did not earn, and the time had come to let someone else know it existed. There are mornings now when I hum the hymn without thinking. That is the small, permanent change the night on the ridge made in me, and it is not a small thing at all. It is the change you feel when a room goes back to its right size, when the weight you have been carrying shifts to something you were built for rather than something you were merely enduring. I hum it at the sink, at the woodpile coming down the trail on still evenings when the cold is dry and the stars are dense, and the old hound is 6 feet ahead of me checking back over his shoulder every 30 yards to confirm I am still there. Outside this morning, Jasper lies on the porch step in the thin winter sun. His chin is on his paws the way it always is when he is watching rather than sleeping, and his eyes are on the tree line at the top of the yard, the hemlock and the ridge beyond it, the pale December sky sitting above everything. The step below him is clean and bare, the way it has been since mid-December. He looks at the ridge the way I have come to look at it, with attention rather than with expectation, with the particular quality of regard you give to something that has been generous to you and that you do not want to take for granted. I went inside and poured my coffee and came back to the door and stood there with the cup warming both hands, looking out at the hound and the step and the ridge. The cold air came in around the frame and I let it. Somewhere on the uphill side of that ridge the timber was standing in its ordinary winter quiet, and I was not afraid of the quiet anymore, and the hymn was in my chest, where it belongs.